Sunday, Monday, happy trains. Tuesday, Wednesday, happy trains. Thursday, Friday, happy trains. Saturday, what a day. Grooving all week with trains. These trains are all set me and free. Oh, happy. The Western Australian Government Railways W class. These are 482 steam locomotives that were designed by Frederick Mills, Charles Clark, and the Bayer Peacock and Company. And they were actually pretty late to the steam locomotive party, and they made 60 of them. They were first proposed in 1949 by Frederick Mills, but when he died, Charles Clark took over. They had a relatively low axle load, and that was really important because they needed to be available across the entirety of WAGR's network. They were meant for freight service, but they did regularly haul passenger trains as well. And they basically replaced the O and G classes that were quite old by this point and operating on the lighter parts of the network. The class had a really good reputation. They were free steamers and very strong pullers. And outside of some really early teething troubles that were worked out, they were also very reliable. They were built between 1951 and 1952. And while they were late to the party, they did last a decent amount of time, with the last one not being withdrawn until 1972. And this also meant that preservation for them actually has been alarmingly strong. I mean, like, way better than you'd expect for Australia. Australia was a little later to the preservation movement and had a much more rough go about it. But even by US or UK standards, the W class has gotten an insane amount of preservation. They managed to save 15 of these locomotives. 15 out of 60 for a steam locomotive isn't that bad in terms of preservation. It's actually really good, way better than a lot of others. Some of them are kept on static display, but a few have been in working order, having permanent homes on heritage railways, safe in the land down under. The Montreal Locomotive Works M420s. You know, when I talked about Montreal Locomotive Works, I figured this might happen, and I got a direct request for it, so, you know, I think that's fair. These were diesel-electric locomotives, manufactured between 1973 and 1977. One of the last locomotives that Montreal Locomotive Works was responsible for, but with it they proved that they could indeed make solid diesels. They'd already proven that, but this is just more consistencies for them. Montreal knew what they were doing, they handled themselves well, and they built a total of 88 of these diesels for various Canadian railways, with most of the production going to Canadian National. Only 7 were sold outside of Canada, some going to Venezuela, and a few going to Providence and Worcester Railroad in the United States. These were one of the first locomotives to use the wide-nose comfort cab that Montreal Locomotive Works had indeed developed, based on the request from Canadian National. Sometimes called safety cabs, that not only made the cabs more comfortable for railroad workers, but also made it so that they'd be safer in the event of a collision. And they worked really well, to the point that they still are used on many diesels now. Now, the M420s did indeed serve pretty well, all things considered. They were considered quite reliable, and were only really withdrawn because the railways wanted to standardize their diesel lines by using only EMD and GE. By the time the M420s were taken out of service, Montreal Locomotive Works was no longer a thing, so it did make sense to replace them, but they were sold off to other second-hand owners. While a handful have been scrapped over the years due to the cost of maintaining older diesels, a few were also sold off, and there's still a handful of examples believed to be floating around out there somewhere, but it doesn't seem that any of these are officially in preservation based on what I can tell. Hopefully, at least one will find its way to a museum at some point, but it doesn't seem to have happened just yet. Still, the fact that they're still being used even now shows how good they honestly were. The London Midland and Scottish Railway Princess Royal class. They're princesses! They need crowns! Princess! Only 12 of these locomotives were produced, but I've gotten this request a lot, as these 462 Pacific steam locomotives were designed by one William Stanier, ever consistent in his ability to design quality steam locomotives. They're actually related to the Great Western Railway's 6000 class, which are also known as the King class. In fact, they're basically the same, except that the Princesses have larger fireboxes that are supported by additional trailing wheels. The Kings were 460s. And it makes sense because Stanier did come from the Great Western Railway to work on LMS. They were meant for passenger service, but they could pull freight trains fairly well, and they were known to be pretty reliable, as most Stanier locomotives tended to be. They eventually fell into the hands of British Rail, and of course, most of them were scrapped during the modernization plan because I don't know what you expected when I said that. But, to be fair, 2 did wind up preserved. 6201 and 6203, or Princess Elizabeth and Princess Margaret Rose. Princess Elizabeth, mind you, is named for Elizabeth II, the Queen of England. Well, former, since she is now sadly deceased. And Princess Margaret was the Queen's little sister. Both examples have been restored to operating condition at points during their history, but as it stands right now, neither is running. Princess Margaret Rose hasn't ran since 1996, and she's currently sitting on static display. Princess Elizabeth actually ran as recently as 2021, but she was withdrawn in August of that year as she had a pretty sizable crack in her firebox. This obviously has to be replaced, but that's expensive, and they haven't managed to bring in the money in order to do that yet. So she's sitting in storage, though I doubt either is going anywhere regardless. So it is nice that these great locomotives did see a fair amount of preservation. The South African class 19D482s. Between 1937 and 1949, the South African railways began placing these new locomotives in service. They actually built 33 more between 1951 and 1955 because, as it turned out, these are probably some of the best locomotives that came out of South Africa. They, in fact, wound up building a total of 268 of these things. They were very good, and the 19Ds were actually nicknamed Dolly, which is really cute, and I love it. They were very similar to their predecessors, the 19Cs, but they decided to use piston valves and the ever-reliable Walschaerts valve gear instead of a rotary cam poppet valve gear. This, along with a bunch of other modifications, made them a lot better than their predecessors, and the Dollies continued reliable service right up until the end of steam. And even then, a lot of them were sold off for more industrial applications, and incredibly, as late as 2011, 2 of them were bought for mining purposes. They're believed to have been numbers 2678 and 2689, and they were put back into revenue service in June of 2012, although the mine closed in late 2016, which naturally put the locomotives out of work again, and they were put up for sale in December of 2018. It's not known what will happen to them now, but the point is they were still using these locomotives in the 2000s. They were really good, and continue to be. And fortunately, because they were so numerous, preservation for these particular locomotives has been just insane. By my count, currently, among the locomotives that are officially in preservation, and I don't believe this counts the ones that are still being used for revenue service, or were, there are 53 currently preserved. That is incredible, and I applaud it, of course. It's good to see that South Africa genuinely cares about preserving their railroad history. The Dublin and South Eastern Railway, numbers 15 and 16. Sometimes these are called the GSR 461 class or the CIE K2 class, but according to sources, DSER didn't actually call them anything, so we're just going to call them the Irish Twins! Now, I know I'm playing Donald and Douglas's theme over this, and I'm well aware that Donald and Douglas are Scottish, but as soon as I saw that these were a pair of locomotives, I just couldn't resist. They're twins! And they were built for the heavy goods freight traffic on the Dublin to Wexford main line on the DSER. They were actually built by Bayer, Peacock and Company, and they served faithfully for many, many years despite being built in 1922. They weren't withdrawn until the 1960s, and they're often viewed as 2 of the best Irish steam locomotives ever. It's a wonder that DSER didn't make more of this type, but perhaps they only needed the twins. And though I hate to be the bearer of bad news and tell you the siblings were separated, well, it's sadly true. When CIE got a hold of them, they used them until the end of Steam, of course, but eventually they decided to scrap one of them. It wound up being number 16. So number 15 lost her sister, and both had been renumbered by this point. Number 15 was 461 and 16 was 462, but I'm still going to call them 15 and 16. 15, however, was much more fortunate than her twin, as CIE chose to preserve her following an appeal by the Irish Railway Records Society, who was one of many groups in the 60s trying to keep railways from scrapping their steam engines. Eventually the CIE chose to present her to RPSI in 1977, and they were the ones that chose to give her an overhaul and put her back into service in late 1990. She's had several overhauls since then, but she's been used consistently back in service ever since. And she's also really historically relevant. Not only is she the only survivor of her particular design, and of course, the last sibling, I'm sorry about your sister, but she's also the only surviving DSER locomotive in general. No other locomotives from them were preserved. So she really stands as a unique piece, but she's also a highlight of Irish locomotive history. And with that, a special thank yous to all my underwater train finders: Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsune 131-232, Josh Johnson Metal for Life, Guy Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hawk 444, The Baxter, That Guy with a Beard, Mark Holding, Lockcracken, Murder Jonesdahl, A Person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal 12860, Iserfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, Matthew Wolf, Dr. Racer 78, Ohio Trucker 1, Mr. Sleepy, Matt Weaver, Alaric Jaspers, Tom Redlion, and NS Productions 8104. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.